welcome back to the We're So Bloody Early podcast. Today, we're very excited to welcome Mr. Andy Edstrom on the show.
Jake, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to tune in and join us. So we've got hundreds and hundreds of questions to ask you, Andy, but to kick things off today, perhaps you could give us a brief overview as to a bit about yourself. So what do you do every day and what's your involvement with Bitcoin? And I can see in the background there a great representation of all the hard work you've done in the space. So just a brief summary on yourself, please.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Los Angeles, which is now home after 8 years not living in LA. That was spent in college, Massachusetts, and in New York. So I spent a few years working on Wall Street for Goldman Sachs, among other places. And I worked for a private equity fund that spun out of Carlisle, and then a hedge fund that's about $5 billion in assets here in LA. And then I joined the family business 9 years ago, which is wealth management, financial advisory. So my father and his founding partner founded the firm over 30 years ago. And I got interested in building that business, which had been run very conservatively. And I also got interested for various other reasons. One was sort of the writing on the wall in terms of the standard alternative asset space, which I felt was probably in decline in the long run, as well as some lifestyle benefits, and also the opportunity to think more broadly in a macro sense, rather than being so focused on individual securities. And then I guess it was 2017, as it was for quite a few people, when I really started paying attention to Bitcoin. I am a 3 exposure guy. So, the first exposure was some article in The Economist about Bitcoin in 2013, which I remember listening to the podcast when I was on vacation, and it totally went over my head. I had no clue, ignored it. 2016, I think it was 2016. Yeah. When I read an article, I think in the Wall Street Journal, about the Ethereum hard fork, right? The DAO fork. I totally didn't understand it then. And then a smart friend of mine named Arun Rao put it back on my radar probably in the second quarter of 2017. And then I really started doing my homework in the middle of the year. And I bought my first Bitcoin in August, literally the day after the Bcash hard fork. And and then I went through the usual journey of all the altcoins and whiz bang cool features and stuff. And then over time, I came to the conclusion that Bitcoin was the thing. I wanted to get exposure for my clients. This was when I started writing the book in January of 2019, with Bitcoin having fallen from around 20K to around 3K. And so I knew that if I was going to buy it for clients, I was going to get labeled a lunatic, given the price action. And so I decided I would have to put it in writing. If I was going to put it in writing for them, I might as well do it for a broader audience, like my friends and my family, who I thought would benefit from it. And I also had a feeling that sort of more regular way legacy finance folks would benefit from a book that was written somewhat in their language. So anyway, I started writing the book at market bottom, essentially in January 19. Book came out in September, and it's been a fun journey since then, talking to people about the book, talking about the ideas. Of course, I've also gotten involved with Swan Bitcoin, and I joined recently to develop and launch and spearhead the Swan Advisor Services investment product, which is a way to get Bitcoin into financial advisors' clients' portfolios. And so that takes us to today.
Awesome. What a summary. I've got loads of questions, but I'm going to palm it over quickly to the boys. So Matty or Jigsy, who would like to jump in first?
Yeah, I might throw a couple of questions at you, Andy. A fascinating insight to the journey from, I guess, 2013. You sort of mentioned that you heard about it and ignored it. I'd love to maybe delve back a little bit earlier than that, if possible, if you're able to share with us just exactly maybe where your mindset was to possibly get to the point of ignoring it in 2013. Where were you maybe pre-2013, and why the mindset was there before that light bulb moment in 2017, I guess.
Sure. So I studied economics in college. And that's to say Keynesian economics, right? So I was inculcated in that mindset. which was a disadvantage clearly for understanding Bitcoin. It really was a handicap. But if I think about where I was in 2013, I joined my family firm's business, wealth management practice, in 2012. So it was soon after that. I'd spent the first decade of my career really doing bottoms up investing. So, standard valuation. I would say I sort of had a value investor's mindset, although I had covered tech a decent amount. So I had some technology exposure, but coming into wealth management caused me to spend more time on macro issues. So I became more interested in other asset classes rather than just equity or just distressed debt, which I had done before, which is basically similar to equity investing in the sense that you really got to deeply understand the businesses and do the bottoms up valuation work. So I had just gotten exposure to a broader macro lens or way of thinking, but I hadn't come very far up the curve, and I had no exposure to the notions of really the Austrian economic school of thought. I mean, I'd had zero exposure. I think I had probably heard of Friedrich Hayek. I had certainly not heard of Mises or Menger or Murray Rothbard. I mean, these were unknown names to me. So I was coming from nowhere in terms of the hard money school, and I had been educated in the fiat system. So that's where I was coming from. So there was, and I'm not a software developer, so there really weren't too many angles, I think, where I could have gotten a purchase on what is Bitcoin, why is it important at that time. And clearly it took a couple of exposures and also, frankly, more size. So when I first started looking at it, I suppose that, I don't know, I guess if Bitcoin was at like 2 or 3K, you're talking a whatever, $50 billion asset or something like that. And so, and maybe all of crypto was like under 100 billion. And so it was getting to the point by then in 2017 where it was actually sort of real. But back in 2013, yeah, there was no chance that this was going to make any kind of impression on my mind, unfortunately, if only it had.
Well, then you mentioned, obviously, was it around around in 2017, the second quarter, the pennies kind of dropped a little bit. Are you able to elaborate sort of the, I'm assuming you had the old family practice and those 10 years of, hard fiat training, for a better word, where you're looking for some conviction in a new financial revolution. You got your eye on it. You obviously come across Aruna, and I mean, how did you come across the friendship, and then what was that moment where you sort of said, okay?
Oh, yeah, sure. You mean with Arun specifically?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to remember actually how I ran into Arun. I think it probably was, it was when I was back at my prior job at Tenenbaum. So I was doing distressed debt investing and equity investing and some private equity stuff. And you know what it was? I think I actually interviewed him. Come to think of it, I think he was coming out of UCLA Business School, I think.
Yep.
And I did interview him. Maybe it was in, I don't know, 2009 or 2010. I had stepped into the role at Tenenbaum of essentially running the new associate recruiting program. And so I met him then, and we'd kept in touch. I mean, he was a broad thinking guy. So he had spent some time in Silicon Valley before business school. He himself had actually written for The Economist briefly, and he'd published a book on the VC industry, I don't know, probably back in the late 2000s, if I had to guess. And then he went to business school, and then he ended up taking a job at PIMCO, which is the big bond, fixed income giant. And he was there for several years, became a portfolio manager, and then went in a very different direction, jumped into tech, and basically started a machine learning startup. And so he just had a range of experiences. But back at the time when I first met him, yeah, he was interviewing for a job.
Fascinating. And do you remember the moment where he said, okay, I'm going to get myself that Bitcoin in 2017?
Well, I don't even know if he had any exposure himself. He had contact with a guy named Ari Paul, who runs Block Tower, which is a multi-coin, multi-digital asset investment fund. And I think it was Ari who had pitched him, and Ari was before he had formed his fund, was at Chicago Endowment and was, kind of feet to the pavement, going around taking meetings, trying to get people to pay attention to this asset class, trying to get the endowment to pay attention. It was too early, it turned out. I think part of his realization in that process was, oh, it's really early, so if nobody else can do it, I should. And so he did. But that was the mutual connection. I think that Arun, put me in touch with Ari, and that's how I first got exposed to the whole thing.
Absolutely fascinating. Jigs.
Yes. Don't take this the wrong way. Just curious how old you are, just for our audience.
Yeah, no worries. So I'm 40.
40. Okay. So interesting, because
do I look older or younger, Jake?
No, well, I actually thought from reading your book you might have been a boomer, just for this reason, and I'll tell you why. So I was trying to get my father across the line about the importance of holding at least 50% of his wealth in Bitcoin, and he bought some, but said to me that I shouldn't drink all the Kool-Aid. And I said, that's fair enough. That's cool. So I'm a runner, and on my long runs, I listen to podcasts or generally audio books. So I'm listening to yours amongst many others, just depending on what mood I'm feeling. And after I started to listening to yours, I immediately purchased it. My old man lives in San Diego, so I sent it to him, and he read it, and it got him over the line straight away. And I thought, well, you must be a boomer if you've got a boomer over the line. So that's why I was just curious.
Well, so it's interesting you mentioned that, and that's a great story. I love that I played a small role in orange pilling one more boomer, which is great. And yeah, look, so my client base is actually relatively older. So I have plenty of boomer clients, and as I mentioned earlier, I did write the book with my clients in mind. And so I suspect that there's some reflection there of, legacy finance plus older generation view of the world. And, I've been pleasantly surprised basically at the reception from that generation. It seems to resonate, relatively well, which is great because, it takes all kinds. We need content for youngsters and the oldsters and everyone in between.
Yeah, I wasn't sure where you're going there. Sorry, Jake. I wasn't sure where you're going there asking his age, mate. Bloody hell.
I just thought if Tinder worked across the world, I don't know.
Yeah, you'd have a crack.
I think it's just I spend a decent amount of my time talking to boomers, and it's probably rubbed off on me.
Yeah.
Well, just to jump in, so Andy, thanks so much for sharing all of this. So it's awesome to learn about your personal journey. For me, when I read Why Buy Bitcoin, it was an important part of the puzzle, in that there's all of this kind of external clarification from different players in the Bitcoin space that you're on to something interesting, and you listen to Michael Saylor talk for literally 10 minutes, you're like, holy shit, this is really fucking cool. We need to pay more attention. Or whoever might have been influential character in your process to the asset class. But I loved that you were a financial advisor, and you'd done all the exams, you'd done years of actually working for companies doing this already. And you'd sat down and get, right, okay, this really makes sense. Now, not enough financial advisors are recommending it. Now, maybe that's for regulatory reasons or whatever. I know one wealth manager here in Sydney who has been getting his clients to buy Bitcoin for about 4 or 5 years. Nice. But personally, I've used wealth management services for 10 years and no one had ever mentioned it. If anything, you bring it up in a meeting and they're like, oh, it's there's no CEO. They can print as much of it as they want. If anything, we'll go for, the Bank of England coin when it comes out. And you're just like, you have no idea what you're talking about. Yeah. So yeah, it was awesome to hear something from someone who's got such pedigree in the financial advisory business to then help make your own decisions. So I'm sure there's many people out there that have helped their process for buying Bitcoin thanks to your book. So yeah, thank you. One thing I wanted to ask you about, Andy, was
go ahead.
So your new role with Swan, you're obviously heavily involved, as I mentioned, in financial advisory roles from previously. What's the biggest challenge in trying to persuade people that Bitcoin's a good thing to buy? I mean, you've literally written a book on it, but Do you get the same questions all the time about why it's a bad idea? And what's the biggest focus for you over the next kind of 6 months trying to do that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jake. So a couple things. So the first of all, my experience has been like yours until very recently, which is to say financial advisors basically are nowhere on Bitcoin. And when I published the book in 2019, I started talking about it and it was like shouting into the void. And there was just very, very little interest. It was all skepticism. Surprise, surprise, number goes up and maybe we get a little more inflation showing up in the figures. And all of a sudden seems to be more interest. Now, regarding, favorite criticisms or favorite pieces of FUD, it's funny you asked that because I think it was literally last week, I published an article on CoinDesk addressing my clients' favorite 3 pieces of FUD. And they are still, number 1, prohibition. Number 2, competition and obsolescence. And number 3 actually is quantum computing. And so those are still the 3 biggest ones that I get lately. And they're timeless. I mean, the quantum threat is technically real. And yes, you have to have some faith that, as with the history of cryptography up to this point, the cryptographers will come up with more and better and more clever algorithms for securing information. And I think they will. And by the way, we got to get to, I don't know, thousands of qubits per quantum computer. And I think we're maybe at 100. So it could take a while. And then, the obsolescence thing doesn't go away. Although I'm somewhat pleasantly surprised at the fact that more and more people have concluded that Bitcoin has won the hard money category, and that, there's a bunch of other, whizzy and fun other digital assets, but they're really not going to compete with Bitcoin to be hard money. So that is starting to take hold in people's minds, but they still ask about, but what about XYZ other cryptos? And then prohibition is still there. As you guys know, virtually all signs are positive, at least in the United States, generally speaking in the Western world, although I'll let you speak for Australia. I'm much
that's positive here.
I'm much less expert, but it's good to hear. And so, that's still the major issue, that people struggle to get their heads around this idea that governments will let go of their ability to print the money. And I can't remember, someone mentioned Saylor earlier. I actually like Saylor's framing, which is like, look, this is property. Yes, it's a monetary asset, but are people transacting with it and using it as medium of exchange? Hardly at all. Will they anytime soon? No, probably not. The dollar isn't going away. If anything, it's probably the weaker fiat monies that are likely to get eaten by dollar stable coins. And so, the dollar, in my opinion, has very little to fear, at least for any conceivable time frame that politicians might care about. And in the meantime, basically Bitcoin's been welcomed with open arms in the US and, various levels of acceptance throughout the rest of the Western world, certainly. So these are still the primary pieces of FUD, the primary criticisms, and yet the facts are pretty strongly in favor of Bitcoin right now.
Yeah, on that, there's one thing you talk about, the prohibition. What are your thoughts, obviously being in LA, with someone like crypto.com taking over the Stable Center, the rebranding of that? To me, as a massive sports fan, that captures my attention enormously here from Australia, let alone on your front doorstep. What does it do in that space when you start seeing some of these altcoins and exchanges really wanting to brand themselves as, we're serious here, we're taking over one of the most famous stadiums in the world because we mean business? I mean, how do you interpret that?
Yeah. Mixed feelings. On the one hand, it's positive because it's just indication of mainstreaming of the broader asset. On the other hand, I find it's a distraction. And I really do think that for 95 or 99% of people, the thing to do is just accumulate, save in Bitcoin. Don't mess around with all these other crypto assets, because mostly it's an insider game. And so if you're not an insider, if you're not a founder, if you're not one of the VCs that writes a big check early on and then promotes it, chances are good you're going to be left holding the bag in the long run. So mixed feelings about it. I mean, the good thing about Bitcoin is, in my mind, it has won in the category of hard money. It is extremely, basically impossible to kill. It is likely to dominate the monetary use and at least the digital property use in the long run. And so all we have to do is keep building. But I do feel for those retail folks, let's say, just average people who get caught by the crypto bug, and especially at the wrong point in the cycle, and end up with big losses owning assets that are, pump and dump schemes, fraudulent, hopelessly unable to compete against an asset like Bitcoin. And it's the darker side of this whole phenomenon. It was inevitable that if someone could create Bitcoin, someone would create thousands of others, and it may take a very long time for the chaff to be separated from the wheat. But those are my thoughts.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, further to that, you rightly mentioned to all our listeners the importance of the accumulation of Bitcoin as a hard money asset that appears to have won, like with the Lindy effect. It's certainly winning that trajectory at the moment. And the thing that I've learned as a noob to the industry, I mean, I'm not sure if you know much about the connection between Jigs, myself, and Jake, but it's really a relationship that's only 6 months old, and I've only been really involved financially.
He's a noob.
Yeah, I'm a noob.
Nice.
And I'm I'd like to think I'm an intelligent noob, but I'm a noob.
Everyone shows up at a different time. So, we all get there eventually, and you're still ahead of who knows how many, the vast majority of humanity. So
yeah, but the one thing you mentioned there about the people coming in at the wrong time, if we look at markets over the last few weeks, has been close to a 30-40% correction on some coins. And for those that got in at a time where Bitcoin was mid 60s, and you're probably a little bit nervous if you've invested your first dollar. But that's a part of the long-term vision and strategy. And your book is incredible on that aspect. It's sort of an overview. And the old topic that you raise about the fraudulent nature of some of them and the rug pulls. I mean, for me, when I'm looking at and listening to you about the hard money and effectively Bitcoin winning the race in this space with the cryptography, I wonder what your thoughts are also on regulation on this space to help mature it a bit more. I sort of look at regulation, at least here in Australia, we're heavily regulated, but we seem to be okay with it. Australia seems, as Jigs mentioned before, to be quite proactive with the adoption, at least understanding it. Yeah, we're going to be taxed and all those things, and that happens already. But I don't understand enough from the US side of things about the SEC and how that's going to potentially play out and what that may look like for the market. I think it would be a healthy thing. Obviously, if it's not overregulated, but keen to get your thoughts on how that may affect Bitcoin as well, and really nailing down its stance on winning the game in the hard money space.
Sure, happy to, Matt. So a little bit of recent history. Well, first I'll say is there's already heavy regulation and pretty broad compliance, I would say, in the United States with respect to money transmission and the rules associated with that, including know your customer and anti-money laundering rules, right? After 9/11, after the Patriot Act, it got pretty onerous to move money, at least around in the United States.
Yeah.
And, most of the companies, exchanges, et cetera, have been complying with those rules for years now. Okay. The second fact is Bitcoin is always and everywhere not a security, at least under US law, right? It never was. It never tripped the prongs of the Howey test, which is the standard securities definition, at least under United States law, because it was mined, because it wasn't sold for money because it was launched in functional form, before anyone was transacting, et cetera, et cetera. Now, everything else, I shouldn't say everything else, most of the other assets, in my non-securities lawyer opinion, did trip the Howey test, and many of them still do. Now, there's some interesting ambiguity around this notion of, could something have been a security at issuance, and can it cease to be a security because it is sufficiently decentralized? Maybe, but we don't know what sufficiently decentralized means. The history now becomes relevant because for the first few years, obviously, of its existence, the, let's say, digital asset or crypto universe was too small to matter. Basically, nobody was paying attention. Very few people were. And then you had a Republican administration under Trump, right? 2016 to 2020. And so what happens under Republican administrations with respect to regulation and enforcement? Usually not a lot. It's pretty hands off. And that's what we saw with Chairman Clayton and the SEC under that administration. Okay, now there's a new cop on the beat. Biden was elected, and Gensler is a Democratic regime regulator. So he's gotten a bit more aggressive, or at least he's making more aggressive noises. Now, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. One of the problems with enforcement, and by the way, in my opinion, this extends to a lot of areas of the law, is prosecutors hate to lose. And the SEC brags about how they never lose a case, which in my opinion is not something to brag about, because it implies you're probably not bringing enough cases, right? If you're taking zero chance of loss, then you're probably missing some good opportunities. And so, yes, there have been some cases brought, a handful. Mostly the settlements have been really light. I mean, you had, I can't remember if it was EOS probably that raised billions of dollars in what was a security offering at the time without registering properly. And they ended up paying, I don't know, like a few tens of millions of dollars in fines or something. It was a tiny fraction of the money that they raised. In other words, it was totally worth it for them, for the guys that took the money. Yeah. So, yeah, I think we'll see more action, more enforcement. To my mind, it's never been a better time to be a Bitcoin only company, right? Because you're Teflon. I mean, you are, as long as you're complying with money transmission rules, essentially, you're safe from the securities, the potential securities enforcement. And for people who are, I take your point about, it'd be great if we had clearer regulation. And I tend to agree. Although part of me sort of doesn't care, because for me, Bitcoin is the thing. And I think it's most important that Bitcoin grows and expands and attracts talented people to build out use cases in companies and second and third layers so people adopt it. So, but I think that in terms of securities enforcement, I think there probably will be more cases. But in terms of clearer legislation or different legislation, I'm really not holding my breath in the US, because it's really difficult to get any kind of difficult or nuanced regulation through Congress. And so will it happen eventually? Maybe, but I don't know if it'll be anytime soon. We'll see.
Fascinating.
Jakey?
Yeah, I can jump in, unless Jigsy has a question.
Oh, I got a quick one. I read your article in BTC Times, Don't Get Wrecked. And earlier in the year, I figured out collateralized debt-based loans with your BTC and that. And this was a game changer for me. Because I'm a hybrid trader, I can generally pick bottoms and limit my risk. And so I was wondering about like those loans that you take against a BTC, they like a margin call provision. Is that right? Such as like term debt. Is this what Michael Saylor does with his MicroStrategy? And can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, great question. It's one of my favorites. It's one of my favorites to talk about. So there are, in my mind, two types of debt, and they're the ones you described. There is term debt, where you have a maturity, hopefully years from now.
Like on your property?
Yeah, exactly. Like with a mortgage.
Yep.
That is by far the most common type of debt that people deal with, at least in terms of the dollar amount. It's a huge market, the mortgage market, of course. So yeah, you have 10 or 20 or 30-year maturity debt, at least in the United States. And as long as you can make your interest and your amortization payment, you're fine. Then in contrast, we have what you mentioned, margin debt, which is where it is marked to market continually. And if the price of the asset, which you have pledged as collateral against the loan, falls, you can get the rug pulled. You can get liquidated. You can get REKT wrecked. And so, and that was what I was warning folks against in that article that you mentioned in March. And unfortunately, the leverage liquidations that I feared happened. They happened sooner than I thought they would happen. I was sort of thinking, we'll probably make it to six figures before this becomes a real problem for people. But instead, we had the China mining ban, which forced the mining out, which meant that miners had to sell Bitcoin to raise cash to relocate, plus a couple other factors. And yeah, clearly there were leverage liquidations in that in that round at that time, subsequent to that article. And then we saw some of that as well, I would argue, a few weeks ago. And yeah, I am always warning people against using margin debt to, basically to take on more extra long exposure, leverage long exposure on Bitcoin. My perspective is, look, if you want to do that with some part of your stack that you're willing to lose, by all means, play around if you must. I don't do it at all. I look forward to a time when I can access term debt. You mentioned Michael Saylor. That's what Michael Saylor does. He issues 5-year maturity convertible bonds. So he gets 5 years, which includes an entire halving cycle plus a little bit.
Yep.
And there's never been, as you know, there's never been a 5-year period where Bitcoin's price is down. So he's safe. And then lately he did a high yield bond. I can't remember what the maturity was on that one, probably 5 years, maybe longer. And then lately he's been issuing equity, which has no maturity risk, doesn't pay an interest rate. So yeah, for us mere mortals, I have not found a term debt product that has a reasonable interest rate, that has a long enough maturity for my taste, where I'm willing to take the risk. And one more thing, if you'll humor me, one thing I hear people say is, well, I'll just take a really low loan to value, right? I'll just borrow a small percentage of what I'm pledging as collateral. I disagree with that strategy completely. In my opinion, if you've got whatever, let's say you got a 10 coin stack. Okay. I would rather that you pledge one of those coins and buy an extra coin, right? So you borrowed an amount equal to what you pledged as collateral, and just risk, getting liquidated in a big downturn, which you would have done, in the period earlier this year.
Yep.
And just live with the fact that you've risked some of your stack. I'd rather people do that than they pledge 9 coins as collateral to buy 1 coin. And they think, oh, I'm only levered, 10% loan to value. Well, there's no guarantee that Bitcoin doesn't fall 90% in a short period. And then you've lost your whole stack or almost all of it. So I would rather people go high leverage on a smaller amount than low leverage on a larger amount, because the low leverage on a larger amount, although it has a much lower probability of going wrong, the magnitude of pain you will suffer if it does go wrong is so extreme.
Yeah, great response.
And don't try to be Michael Saylor. You can't. Almost nobody, unless you're CEO of a public company that you control, or a private company that you control, that has access to very favorable financing terms. Unless and until there's a term debt product in the market with a reasonable interest rate and a long maturity, the rest of us mere mortals will probably have to wait.
I mean, Andy, on that point, I don't think anyone's replicated the MicroStrategy story at all, from what I know, which probably means there's only one company in the world that is actually capable of doing that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I guess I can't. I mean, certainly he's a pioneer with respect to raising huge amounts of money and buying tons of Bitcoin. I mean, he's managed to hoover up a significant
It's
chunk
mad, isn't it? Yeah.
of the total supply, right? Well over 100,000 coins. So, he's well on his way to what 1% of the outstanding. I don't think he'll make it to 1%. I think the price will get away. We'll get away from him before that happens. But yeah, he's done it in size. But I don't discount the possibility that someone else could do it. I mean, in fact, I would expect to see a range. I would expect to see a range of outcomes, and it depends on the characteristics of the business. So you look at someone like, I don't know, big tech giant like, Apple or Microsoft. It's no surprise that Apple is not messing around buying Bitcoin on their balance sheet because they have a high valuation and an extremely successful business, and they don't want to screw it up. At the opposite, oh, and by the way, Tim Cook doesn't control the board. At the other end of the spectrum are smaller companies where one or a couple people have control, where they may have decent businesses that are cash flowing such that if Bitcoin hits a tough spot, they could still make the interest payments on the debt. But maybe that aren't trading at, 35 times earnings. I mean, that was part of the story of MicroStrategy was it was kind of undervalued. It didn't have a very exciting valuation. I don't remember what the valuation was, prior to the Bitcoin move. Maybe it was trading at 10 times earnings or something. It was not trading at 30 or 40 times earnings. So those are the types of businesses I would say that had lower valuations and, one or two people controlling them that are more likely to do it. But I guess, Jake, if we're going to make a bet, like, is nobody going to replicate that strategy? I would probably bet that I'd take the other side of that bet, that eventually someone will do something similar.
Well, I have to say, I'd be on the same side of the bet as you. I'm just more a highlight of like how many people are stock listed, how many people are the founders of their own business, how many people control the board, how many people have that kind of autonomy within their own business that is that large and can take on debt potentially against their own stock or whatever he's done. So I just wondered whether or not there's no one else. It's a very unique position that the man's in, basically, and hence we haven't seen hundreds of others do it straight away.
I agree with you. It's a very small subset of the possible universe of companies that are in that position. Now, to Michael's credit, I think one of the reasons he was the first to come through is he is extremely intelligent, understands software, understands network effects. By the way, I recommend his book, The Mobile Wave, which was published in 2012, which made some specific predictions, quite a few of them that have already come to pass. And I mean, yeah, he is the type of guy who had the intelligence and also the background to dive quickly down the rabbit hole. And it still hasn't been that long since he made his move, for others to catch up. If it's another year from now and we haven't seen someone make similar moves, then I'll probably be more skeptical of the notion that we're going to see much of similar actions from other companies in size. But I still think we're kind of early. It takes a certain amount of research, and then you have to go through all the run all the traps of going through the accounting and going through the compliance and onboarding with your custodian and your, the trading desks that you're going to accumulate through, and all the disclosure, et cetera, et cetera. So it does take a while. Basically, even if you're ready to do it as a manager, it takes, my guess is 9 months, to actually launch the thing. So my guess is we'll see some more announcements in 2022.
Just one very quick one. You just mentioned there, we're kind of early, and hence the title of our podcast, We're So Bloody Early. We believe we are.
You're right. You are. We are.
And just to riff off that, Matty.
Exactly.
So Andy, I'm aware of time, so we'll wrap it up very soon. But just to look further forwards, I'd love to understand how you see the impact of Bitcoin on your own personal life and wider society. How drastically might the difference be, 10 years from now on day-to-day life? And just to highlight that emphasis on like how early we are in the technology adoption of this particular asset.
Yeah. So a little bit, I think, as you say, because we are so bloody early.
Yes.
I'm not. The short-term answer is, if I wind forward 5 years, does life look that different? Probably not. If I wind forward 10 years, then we get into the larger dynamics, like the long-term debt cycle, like there being too much debt and ongoing money printing at an accelerating rate. And so on a 10-year time span, I tend to think that there are likely to be major changes in society. I just read Ray Dalio's most recent book, where he lays out the framework for how it goes when you get to a point of too much debt in a fiat money system, plus internal tensions, conflicts. I'm talking about the US now primarily, plus a rising foreign power, that's China, and a declining hegemon, that's the US. You tend to get fireworks. And I am also a believer in, the fourth turning framework, which is, we're due for a major reorganization, let's say probably within a decade. So if you go look past that and you say 2 decades from now, what's the world look like? Yeah, I think it does look probably pretty different. I think probably Bitcoin is broadly adopted. I think it is harder for governments to waste as much money as they do today. I think we have more sovereign autonomy, sovereign individual type stuff. I hope that it becomes a core life skill to manage private keys, whether it's your assets or your family's assets, or it's your personal information on the internet. And I think the internet will have, further reached into all of our lives. We will spend more and more time online, metaverse type stuff. So yeah, I think it's going to look pretty different. I am looking forward to less misallocation of capital on a hard money standard like Bitcoin. I am looking forward to the ability to safely hold one's own assets away from confiscation. And, that's true as an American, but it's even more true, I think, for folks throughout the world who live in regimes where their property rights are not respected. And yeah, I think that I kind of buy into the notion that we could have a renaissance given the huge amount of capital that's probably been misallocated and wasted under the fiat money system. I think that better husbanded capital at more realistic interest rates and rates of return could result in much more efficient capital allocation and therefore favorable advances in technology, in industry. So I think the future is bright. I do believe in a bright orange future, like my boss, Corey Clipston, likes to say. I think it could be a dicey path on the way to that bright orange future. My belief is one of the best things that I can do, or many of us can do, is our little part to educate people and also basically make our jurisdiction safe for Bitcoin. Make Australia safe for Bitcoin, make America safe for Bitcoin. Bitcoin has already won, in my opinion, but I think we can travel the easy path or the hard path, and different countries and different societies and groups of people will take different paths. And so my feeling is that as Bitcoiners, one of the best things we can do is try to help our societies, our countries, our families onto the easier path to transition.
Yeah.
It's very exciting, isn't it? Well, Andy, thank you so much for your time today. Boys, any final questions or comments?
Thanks very much for joining us. Great book.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you, gentlemen. Great questions. Love what you guys are doing. And I guess in closing, all I'll say is, of course, if people want to check out the book, it's Why Buy Bitcoin. It's on Amazon and other places as well. Swan Bitcoin. For financial advisors. By the way, the site is swanbitcoin.com or swanbitcoin.com/Andy. And for financial advisors, if there are any out there, or if there are any listeners who have a financial advisor and would like their financial advisor to consider managing a portion of the portfolio in Bitcoin, it's swanbitcoin/advisor to check out our new product. And of course, if people want to find me on Twitter, it's Edstrom Andrew.
Awesome. Well, Andy, thanks so much for your time. We'll be posting this episode very shortly. And yeah, those that have been following along will be very excited to hear from you. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jake. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Jigs. Take care.
Have a great Christmas, mate.